Welcome to the 10th Living God's Future Now conversation hosted by Heart Edge. Heart Edge is an ecumenical movement for church renewal arising out of St Martin in the Fields in London, now on 4 continents globally, that believes renewal of the heart comes from the edge and seeks to catalyse kingdom communities through the 4 C's of commerce, culture, compassion and congregational life. Since May 2020, we've been running a continuous festival of theology and practice, of which this monthly second Thursday conversation is the flagship event. Please see notices in the chat or on our website for how to get more involved. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Maggie Dawn. Reverend Professor Maggie Dawn is the principal of St Mary's College, Durham, and Professor of Theology in Durham University's Department of Theology and Religion. Maggie's first career was as a songwriter, guitarist, and singer. She recorded 5 albums under her own name and was a session player in several other bands. Maggie studied theology at the University of Cambridge in the 1990s, where her PhD research explored Samuel Taylor Coleridge's theological language. Her ongoing research interests are the role of voice and form in the creation of theological meaning, and the role of the arts in theology and liturgy. She began her academic career as college chaplain and teaching fellow at the University of Cambridge. She's published 5 books, one of which was quoted in Parliament in 2012 to launch a private member's bill. Before coming to Durham, she spent 8 years as Associate Dean and Associate Professor of Theology and Literature at Yale Divinity School and the Institute of Sacred Music. Maggie, it's a real pleasure to have the chance to talk to you like this. I wonder if we could start, because all our conversations are focus on one or more of the 4 C's, and obviously culture is as well as the others, but culture in particular is your territory. So I'm interested in the phrase "the arts." It's a loosely used term. It pulls together a lot of things which in some ways aren't that similar. You obviously have established a reputation in one part of the arts, and now have got a reputation across the arts. Could you tell us how you see the arts as a field, and culture more generally as an entity? Is that a helpful thing or an unhelpful thing?
Yeah, no. Well, it's broad, as you say, Sam, because they're all terms that we use in very broad and multifaceted ways. And without wanting to get nitpicky, I think the first thing is to say, well, what are we talking about here? And I mean, you've written about culture yourself and very cleverly pointed out that culture can mean, just generally the society and all that great web of assumptions that we live with. Or it can mean something more like, culture, as in the arts and the literature and the specialized ways in which we write about, express what we think. Or I would say not just how we express, but in fact that the arts, this is where the arts has really coalesced with liturgy for me. I think that the arts don't just express what we think or what we believe or how we feel, but they actually shape what we think and what we feel and what we believe. So it's not just a way of saying, I feel really happy, let's pull out a happy song and sing a happy song to Jesus. It's also that what we sing will make us think, feel and believe certain things over the course of time. Probably with a drip, drip, drip effect, but the arts shape us. And because of that, I think it's really worth taking notice of what we're doing in our fellowship and our liturgy, perhaps especially liturgy, because, we sing and we sit in buildings that are built in particular ways and smell a certain way and look a certain way. And all of the visual and oral and heard and sung experience builds in us an entire experience of our faith and shapes it. So we ought to pay attention to it because, it's a big deal.
Mm. But there's also, I guess, in a sense, if there's an elephant in the room in this conversation, it's probably the fact that art can become an artifact and then can become something that somebody becomes an expert in. And it moves away from something that expresses somebody's highest ideals and shapes the way, as you've said, they think and worship,
Yes.
into what can be for some an elitist and exclusive world of those who appreciate. Could you talk about that from the? And I imagine many of the people on the call will find themselves on one side or other of that exclusive nature of art.
I think that's right. And I think there's two things actually that you've hit on at the same time there, Sam, because um, uh, first of all, there's that thing of culture. I mean, there's another way that we use the word culture, and that's either in a flattering or a pejorative way, in the sense that we might say, oh, well, that's very or this is a very cultured person. And perhaps to mean that they prefer opera over Radiohead, or, you know, they prefer T.S. Eliot over Benjamin Zephaniah, or, you know, the idea that there's high art and then there's the popular stuff, which is not really so cultured. I don't believe that at all. I'm with Kurt Weill on this, who said that there is no such thing as high art and low art. There's just good art and bad art. And you can have good and bad pop music, good and bad dub poetry, good and bad literature, good and bad everything. But the point is it good? So then that takes you to the other part of your question, which is, if we're assessing whether this or that artist is a good one, does that mean that only the high-ranking professional artists can make expression in church? And what happens to the rest of us? One of the things that was the most, it was great fun actually, but it was a very formative experience for me working at Yale Divinity School. I'm really happy to see on the list at the top at least 2 people there from the Yale Divinity School. Yay, Yaleys. Yeah. There's Elaine waving. So nice to see you among the conversation here. But while I was at Yale, which was for 8 years, I had the incredible opportunity of working with a massively ecumenical community. I think there were 38 or 39 denominations, plus all the people who didn't claim a denomination at all. And we got together for chapel once a day, every weekday, all the way through the year. And we were located in the Institute of Sacred Music, Worship and the Arts. So we had a lot of people who were artistic practitioners or students of the arts. So that made for a really interesting mix. And we were able to draw on exceptional talent to bring things into chapel, but we also explored the idea that the role of an artist in church might not be to come in and bring their beautiful art and say, hey, everybody, look what I did. But to come in and say, this is how I practice my particular artistic skill. Come and join me. And it doesn't matter if you're good at it or bad at it. It only matters that you want to join in. And I will, as an artist, I will take the lead in kind of setting the scene and bringing the equipment and giving you a few clues, but break it open so that people can come and join in. And we made some extraordinary things that were probably wouldn't want to hang them in a gallery. Nevertheless, they were not shabby. They were quite exceptional, and they were also very expressive of our community. And then the other thing that you said was about making an artifact, which I think is a really interesting theological point. Augustine wrote about this, actually. He said that there's a real danger in the arts. He wasn't against the arts, he was very for the arts, but he spotted this danger that if you create something that is incredibly beautiful, the role of that beautiful thing ought to be that through it you perceive the beauty beyond, which is God. But the danger is that you look at the thing and then you want the thing, and the thingness of it starts to take the place of the beauty beyond. And so you start to want the thing and not want God. And or perhaps you think you've got God when all you've got is the thing. That's perhaps even worse danger. Anyway, I was working with a couple of artists at Yale that I brought, one from New Zealand and one from Iowa, which is like slap in the middle of the enormous cornfields of America. And these two artists came over to work with me at different points. And they both worked in ephemeral art. And one of them, Ted Liddenhatten, who's an amazing artist. I'll maybe put his name in the chat if you want to go look up his stuff. But he works specifically in ephemeral art for the purposes of theological reflection and liturgy. And he will go into a building, he will make it site specific. He'll suss out what are the features of this building, what could be put where. Then he talks to the community and he asks them, what's happening in your community? What do you do? How do you feel? What are you going through? And then he would create art that was temporary, but exceptionally beautiful. And it reflected the particular experiences and needs of the community at the time. The community would then get involved in engaging in this in the place of worship. But at the end of the period of time, whether that was a week or two or a month or whatever, then it would just be swept up, packed in boxes, and the piles of salt and the piles of crushed myrrh and the piles of sand and everything would just get packaged up and sent away. And that piece of art was never made permanent. And he said that this is a very deliberate thing, that the thing that should remain with you is not the thing, but the experience. And if the experience of encounter remains with you, the art has done its job. Which was...
Could you say a bit more about that? Because that's quite a different notion to the idea that we go round art galleries if we have those resources, or pottery shops of on a more humble level or whatever, and we just grab the bits that we can afford and we put them in our living rooms. That what you've described is a much more communal phenomenon, but of course it's ephemeral, as you've said. It's something that slips out of your finger. We wouldn't think twice about that for an act of worship, I guess. But maybe what you're saying is that engaging with art and acts of worship are actually more similar than they're sometimes portrayed as being.
I think, yes, and I think perhaps engaging with it in that way can educate your expectations when you do go to an art gallery, so that you might say to yourself, it matters not whether I can buy this thing. It doesn't even matter whether I can come back and see it again next week. What matters is what happens to me today, standing in front of this piece of art, looking at this, Marc Chagall or whatever it happens to be. Something will happen to me gazing at this piece of art, or listening to this piece of music, or whatever it happens to be, or reading a book. And if I never do that again, if I never see it again or hear it again, that doesn't take away from me the experience of having done it the first time. And that's actually the bit that matters. Now, repetition, there's a whole nother conversation about repetition, and that has to do with liturgy too, because there are aspects of liturgy that are deliberately repetitive. But the communal side of it as well, Sam, is interesting. And again, going back to one of the projects I did with Ted, he works with myrrh a lot. He uses piles and piles of crushed myrrh, which looks a bit like Demerara's sugar. It's very fine and slightly translucent, and it smells extraordinary. But he was coming to work, and then he uses these powders as if they're paint. So he'll have something that's pale and medium, grades of medium, and then something that's very dark. And he'll put them all together and use them like paint to draw things on the floor. So he called me up and he said, tell me a bit about your community. He said, I'll bring the myrrh, I'll bring the salt and the sugar, but I want to know what else to use. And he said, where does your community meet apart from chapel? So I said, well, after chapel every day we have coffee hour, which isn't an hour at all. It's about 25 minutes, but that's what we call it because it's America. And so we go into the common room, we all have a cup of coffee, and then we talk. And a lot of what happens in the community happens there. or spills over from chapel to there, or the people who don't come to chapel come to coffee hour. So that's a really important bit of our day. So he said, okay, why don't you save up the coffee grounds from all your coffee hours between now and when I come to visit? And he said, I do not want fresh coffee. Don't buy me fresh coffee. I want the actual grounds that have made the coffee that you actually drank. So he arrived a couple of months later, and by this time we had poured out, he had dried and roasted and, you know, stopped going moldy, all this coffee, and it was nice and dry and ready to be used like paint. And the very first day he was there, we got a group of students together, and Ted said, now tell me about your coffee. Tell me about your coffee hour and your fellowship and your, you know, your conversations. Why is this so essential to your community life? And I will never forget this. One of the students, oh, everybody was saying, you know, the usual stuff like, oh, well, without my coffee and my caffeine, I'd never get through the next lecture. And, you know, I have to have my coffee and it's great to talk to my friends. And sometimes I get to talk to my professors and that's really brilliant. And then one person chipped in and he said, I know this is a hard thing to say, but I think it needs saying out loud. The coffee we drink at coffee hour is quite bitter. And sometimes our conversations are pretty bitter too. And the whole table just went, oh, you know, like, oh my goodness, somebody said out loud what nobody dared say. And that matter of the conversation, the sweetness and the bitterness and the slight disjunction between them then became a really interesting feature. And Ted then drew that together with the myrrh that he brought, because myrrh comes from the dindin tree. And myrrh is created when resin pours out of a wounded tree to heal it. So he immediately went into action saying myrrh is about healing. We're dealing with some bitter stuff here, and we've brought some healing. How do we bring those together? So we ended up with these beautiful structures and sort of floor paintings made of all this stuff. And at the end of the week, he gave everybody a little tiny bottle like that big with a cork in the top and said, okay, before we sweep this all up, go and scoop something up and take it away. And everybody scooped up a little bit of myrrh into the tiny bottle. And he said, I want you to take this all over the Yale campus, which is like huge, massive. He said, just go and sprinkle it somewhere that needs healing, and let's take the healing out. It was the most exceptional experience. So, you know, it was art, it was beautiful. And we have photos of it, but nobody could buy it and take it home. And I loved that. I thought it was wonderful. But also it was very particular to our community. If he'd come to St. Martin in the Fields, he'd have done something completely different. And he would have found out what's happening in your community.
No,
So,
no bitterness. That would be the difference, you see. No bitterness at all. Just sweetness.
yes, of course.
Can I just personally ask you, Maggie? I mean, you're a very accomplished and well known in music in one field.
Mhm.
What's it like to go through the experience you've just described into another field of the arts, which isn't your area of technical proficiency or fame, and be just a just a just a citizen, just a disciple, just a
Mm.
uh,
I have to admit, I know a bit more about art than anybody knows, actually. When I was much younger than I am now, working my way up to university, it was never very clear to me whether I should be an artist or a musician, because I was equally good at both. And I was pretty well trained. I did lots and lots of figure drawing. I had a most inspirational tutor when I was about 17 or 18, who pushed me into making sculptures with found objects, which I've continued to do ever since. I think the more interesting thing that I've carried with me actually is it doesn't matter so much whether I know how to do the kind of art that somebody else brings, but I know how to think like a creative. And one of the ways that I've trained my liturgical teams over the course of several decades is when we meet to discuss liturgy, we're not having a committee meeting or a business meeting. What we're doing here is having a creative meeting. we're looking at how we bring all the pieces of what we have into an environment where we break those open for people in such a way that they can encounter what is there. And that is a really different process from coming to a business meeting with an agenda. And in fact, if you think about it, business meetings, usually most people have figured out what the outcome is before you start. And the most critical thing in a creative session is that you do not know the outcome before you start, because then that wouldn't be creative. And to allow something to be creative, you have to start throwing things on the table without an agenda. Mm-hmm. So and I think having had that training since I was, well, I mean, before I even hit my teens, I started learning music when I was about 5, I think. I think I was 5 when I got my first guitar. And started on piano. My mom says I could sing before I could talk. So, you know, I was actually having lessons from a really early age. And I've learned how to do business meetings too, just as a, you know, because there's a necessity there to work in a university. But no, my whole instinct is to work in a creative fashion. And that's the part that I carry with me. So if somebody else comes along and says, well, I'm doing, you know, ceramics, I know nothing about ceramics, but if somebody comes and wants to set up ceramics in my chapel, church or whatever, fine, they go for it. And I kind of understand that I understand something of the process, even though I don't understand the specific techniques. And I like watching them because, wow, you know, it's fantastic to watch people do what they do.
So the first couple of questions that are coming through are about this balance between enjoying the thing and seeing through the thing to the beyond. And Catherine Fleming has put a finger on something I think we should spend a bit of time on, which is what's happened in the last year and the significance of beautiful buildings and to what extent they become the thing, as you've described. Do they become God? Do they become the place in which we definitively experience God? Do they become the only place where we can experience God? And I wonder if you could explore for us both the strengths and the weaknesses of the building, the beautiful building,
yes,
in relation, particularly as we've discovered it in the last year when we've been not allowed to enter it for a lot of the year.
Yeah, really interesting. Thanks. If that's the Catherine Fleming I know, I guess it is. It's George Herbert. Hi, Catherine. Good point that the building. Okay. I think one of the things about buildings is, do we really see the building at all? Sometimes we talk about the building, and what we mean is we're coming to a place that's familiar to get together, but it's about the people actually. Sometimes it's about what we do when we're in the building, and sometimes it really is the building itself. And I think, maybe all of those things are important, but with relationship to not being able to go into the building, when we first went into lockdown, 14 months ago or whatever, and I've been shielding, so I've barely been in a church. I think I've been in a church one time in 14 months. The whole thing about doing Zoom is that at first, I think everybody thought, well, we're doing Zoom to replace being in the building. And we'll perhaps do Zoom from the building so everybody can pretend they're in the building. And I think what's been important for me and for a lot of people is to get much deeper into the recognition that online space is actually a place. And I am not pretending to be at St. Martin in the Fields right now. I am in my house and you're sitting on your sofa, Sam. But we're not disembodied. We are in place. And there's a sense in which the internet gives us a different kind of place. So one of the things that's helpful to me is to try to think about this as a building, but of a different kind. What does this building look like? Get comfortable in it and nestle in a bit and feel like, well, okay, sounds different, looks different, but it is a place, and I think that's going to be important when we do go back to the building, because I think the worst thing we could do is just go back and try and do what we did before. There'd be a lot of things we lose, actually. One of the things that's been amazing to me about online Zoom church is the way in which communities have expanded across the globe. Whenever I am in any corner of the church of the world, I know that I might get invited to speak. If I go to New York, somebody in New York will ask me to go preach or speak at something. But in the last few months, I have spoken in Auckland, New York, London, Edinburgh, I forget, all over the world. I've been all over the world without even leaving my own study. And I hope we don't lose that. And I also noticed that when I do visit places like that, the communities are not just local. They're not all just in the middle of London or just in Auckland. But at the cathedral down the road from me, I check in there for morning prayer most mornings. It's less than a mile away, but I can only go to prayers by going online. So I check in. Now, normally, if you go to morning prayer at Durham Cathedral prior to lockdown, you'd find, I don't know, a dozen people on any given day, and they all live in Durham. But online in Zoom, I am praying with a couple of hundred people, and they're all over the world. Now, I think it would be really, really sad if we lost that when our buildings open up again. So I think we need to think pretty carefully about place and space and what we're going to do with it. Because if we can think in terms of expanded space, I think that would be really a good thing. None of which has answered your question about buildings. When I teach liturgy, I've taught liturgy roughly in a sort of a 12-unit organization, and I never let them get to the book with the words in until we get to about the 5th of the 12 sessions. And the reason for that is because it's a bit like saying, say I've got a book here and I open it up and say, all right, this is Romeo and Juliet. Is this a play? Well, sort of yes, but actually no, this is not a play, this is a script. And the script and the play are not the same thing. And it's kind of the same when you do liturgy. You get your prayer book, you open it up. Well, that's not liturgy, that's just the script. And the script doesn't live. So the first thing you need to do in liturgy is say, well, where are we? What does this sound like, feel like? Snap your fingers and listen to the acoustic. Is this a big, enormous, transcendent acoustic, or is it a small, intimate venue with a sort of sitting room acoustic? That will completely affect what happens to us liturgically in that space. And what does it smell like? Does it smell like 150 years of incense, or does it smell like the builders just left last week, or does it smell strongly of coffee because that's what we do in our church? And all of those things completely affect our experience of a place and a space. So what does it look like, feel like, sound like? What is it, if you touch the walls, what do they feel like? You go in Durham Cathedral, and I keep going on about it, but it's just down the road from me. Go in Durham Cathedral and touch the pillars, which are like, as big as the pillars in Egypt, just about. You sort of feel like there's 1,000 years of prayer been heard that's sort of soaked into those pillars, which is fantastic. But then most of the places I've worshipped in America are considerably less than 200 years old. And that has a different resonance. It's not better or worse, it's just different. And I think attuning yourself to what is my building like that's not like somebody else's building, and what does that do for us? What does it invite? What does it enable? What does it make impossible? Those are important things.
I wonder if I could move us to thinking about how you lead others, whether individuals or a congregation or a community, a college, in your case, a university, a department in your previous life. to discover their previously hidden gifts? How do you? One of the points in the chat is about how quickly people become threatened and defensive if arts or culture for them is something that perhaps makes them feel small, perhaps makes them think that the change is afoot and they're going to lose something precious to them. Could you tell us about how you go about giving encouragement, giving inspiration to people to find something in themselves they hadn't previously found?
Yes, I think I have two sort of overarching questions when I'm trying to help people, and one is what are you good at, and the other is what do you like. What do you really enjoy doing? And I remember one woman who I encountered, and she never used to sing. And I said to her, why don't you sing? And she said, well, I've got a horrible voice. I don't like singing. I don't even really like music very much. And I don't mind everybody else singing, but I really don't want to sing. So I said, well, okay, that's all right. But what are you going to do if you don't sing? And she said, oh, well, I don't know. It doesn't matter. I'll just sort of tag along. And I kept just having conversations with her bit by bit until I found out that she loved poetry. So we introduced the possibility that she might read us a poem from time to time, not every week, but and that other people might read poetry too. And we might draw that in because, I mean, I find it hard to imagine what it's like not to like music, but I know what it's like not to like other things. So just trying an imaginative journey with her and saying, well, whatever it is that you like and whatever it is you're good at must be important to us because you're part of our community. And you shouldn't feel like you have to sit on the back row or, halfway out the door because most people like this or can do that. So what do you like? And that's a good question for calling, actually. When people say that they feel that God is calling them to do something because they think they ought to. I'm like, don't go there. What do you want to do? What do you love doing? What makes you feel most alive and what makes you feel most yourself is a much better question. And not everybody is going to be good at the arts. But to make something live that has a full sort of community engagement, even if you are going to use the arts in a very developed way, you need other skills too. You need somebody who can organize things. You need somebody who can hang stuff up or make things work. I had one team where this marvelous guy, Kevin, came from Jamaica and he works on my team for a while. And he said, I don't really do the arts, but I'd like to work on your team. So we talked a bit and figured out, he'd plenty to offer. So we went for it. And I remember this one time we were putting together a huge sort of sculpted arrangement that needed to hang from the ceiling. And we'd kind of figured out how to make it hang up, but it wasn't quite worked out. And then Kevin suddenly stood up and he said, well, look, you stand there, you do this, you do that, you pull on that rope, you do this. And the whole thing just went up. And I said to him, how did you see that? And he said, oh, well, the one thing I didn't tell you was that I used to be an engineer. Thank you. That's what we need then. Never mind the poetry. What we needed right now was an engineer. Or this other guy who was, he was trying to create something that would hang from the walls only by drawing pins, but it was very heavy in the center. And he showed me a sketch of it. And I said, well, I like the idea, but how on earth is that going to hang from drawing pins from the wall? Won't it all just fall off? Well, he rolled his eyes at me and he says, honestly, Maggie, he said, it's physics. Like, oh, is it? Okay, then. So, you need more than people like me. To make stuff that I imagine happen, I need other people who are not artists at all, or it wouldn't happen.
So it's right at the heart of the heart edge of heart edge is how this kind of a process that you've just described with those two individuals, how that becomes either a metaphor or in fact more than a metaphor for the renewal of the church in general. You'll be more aware than I am that about how people in some cases want to use the arts for growing the church, and that may or may not be the most thoughtful way of approaching the arts. But there's something really powerful about those two stories that you've just told that are about people coming to bring their gifts to the altar, to bring their loaves and fishes to Jesus for transformation. Could you talk a bit about how you see, particularly how you see the church in this country having been back now for just 18 months or so, and where you see the potential for renewal, and where you see culture and the arts within that potential?
That actually, Sam, that's a really difficult question. I might push it back to you even, because I have been back 18 months. The first 5 of that was normal. And since then, it's been, what the last, little while has been like. So I haven't really been to church very much. And of course, I kept in touch with church while I was gone. But I mean, Sam, like me, you spent a good long chunk of time living in the States, further south than I was, better weather. But one of the things I've experienced coming back is the other kind of culture, and I really think you never really understand your own culture until you leave it for a good little while, because you almost can't see what you're in, like goldfish in water. You take yourself out of your own culture and you suddenly start to realize, I understood myself, how British I was by living somewhere else. And coming back, I sort of still feel like I haven't quite landed. And I've got my feet on the ground. And of course, I'm still a British citizen and all of that. But it took me 3 years to settle in the States. And I leapt into it with abandon, thinking, I'm either going to do this or I'm always going to feel like a visitor. And after 3 years, I suddenly realized I wasn't feeling like a visitor anymore. I felt really in it. But I assumed that when I came home, I would just slip back in, and I haven't. I'm still arriving at that. And you had the same experience, Sam. How long does it take? You can reassure me here.
I recognize everything you describe. I think for me, it was an experience where I assumed it was going to be a colossal change to move to North Carolina. And so, in a sense, of course, it was a change, but I was ready for it. And so, all my senses, if you like, were expecting different. That it was a much greater challenge coming back, because just like you, I thought it was an old shoe, and I'd slipped straight back into it. And I was a different person to the person that had left 7 years before, and my family were different people, and Britain was a different country.
Yeah.
So that I recognize that,
Yeah.
that change very much. And the Church of England, bless it, was also different.
It is different.
And was very suspicious of the person who's been away and thinks they know it all when they come back.
Well, I don't
Very
think
suspicious of America.
Sure, what I know. People are very suspicious of America and anybody who identifies in any way as an American. And I've encountered people in the church, very senior people in the church. One person who said to me that my orders as a priest were no longer valid because I'd worked outside the church for too long. Well, okay, then whatever. Fortunately, my bishop up here doesn't think that, so that's a good job. But there is a suspicion about outsiders, and I think that in itself, in fact, is one of the undercurrents to the cultural movements that are happening both here and in the States. And I think the extremes of political movement that have led to Trumpism and to Brexit and some of the associated feelings around that, it seems to me to come from a kind of entrenchment and a suspicion of the outsider. And I think that must be a challenge to us as church, because the call of the gospel is always the opposite of that. It's always the reach out, the let people in, the make myself a servant of the other, rather than othering,
Can I take you back to where you started, in a sense, about talking about the arts, about the way the arts bring us out of ourselves, and you kind of refused a distinction between an elite kind of art, high art, as it's sometimes called, and what people, things of beauty, things of meaning that people produce from themselves. I guess in my question about culture and arts and church renewal was really how the church can be both a place and a movement through which people discover that sense of joy in the glory of putting outside themselves more that was in themselves than they ever realized was there, and how the Christian story can become perhaps the definitive, but certainly a very significant way in which people find the courage, confidence, spirit to do that.
Yeah. I think perhaps the key is what you said a few minutes ago, Sam, when you said that the church sometimes wants to use the arts to, achieve the ends of the gospel, or however you put it. But that phrase, to use the arts to, is something people often say, we should make use of the arts to do this. And I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the arts can do, and actually what any form of creativity can do. And in a sense, there's something about this level of creativity that is not just about whether you're making music or painting or sculpture, but also whether you're working in a scientific lab, or whether you're trying to find a vaccine, or the same sort of imaginative and creative processes are going on, but in a different context. But the thing with the arts is that I think it always goes wrong if you say, we have the gospel, let's get the arts and use them too. As if the arts are a thing that you can add on like an illustration. Because going back to the creative process, I said, you come to a business meeting and you might already have an outcome in mind. But in a creative session, the outcome is not defined. And you're not being creative if you already know what the outcome is. And I think as scientists would say the exact same thing. If they're researching something and they don't know what the answer is, then if they've already decided the outcome, they're not doing proper research. So that creative push is the same in all sorts of fields. And I think the thing for the church engaging in the arts and creativity is to let go of the outcome and let the arts speak for themselves. Because the arts can only speak if you let them have their voice. If you insist that they are nothing more than an illustration of an idea that you've already defined and put in a nice, neat little box. So you say, well, I can explain my idea, I can tell you about my concept, and then I'll read you a poem to prove it. Or I'll put a painting on the screen just to show you in color and style, just as like a little illustrative add-on. But then the painting is not speaking at all, or the poem is not speaking at all, because you've decided and told people what it means before they hear it. And the corollary to that is there's this brilliant story about Robert Schumann, who was playing in a little salon concert. And he played his new piece of music on the piano. And this woman was sitting there and she said, oh, Mr. Schumann, that's just a marvelous piece of music. And thank you for playing. But can I ask you what it means? And he said, oh, yes, madam. And he sat down and he played it again. And I mean, of course, what does music mean is one of the endless and unanswerable questions for musicologists, and people debate endlessly what this or that piece of music means and why people think this is sad or not sad, and so forth. And it's a somewhat intractable question, but I think the point is that if you insist that this piece of art must mean this, and you choose, there's another thing I've written about this, about songs, hymns and songs and liturgy, that I did a piece of research on why people in churches use a certain set of repertoire for their hymns and songs, whether that's pop songs or traditional hymns, whichever, it doesn't matter. And I asked people who were organists and choral directors, and I asked people who led rock band type worship arrangements. So across the musical board. And the first question I asked was this: when you choose a piece of music, what is the basis on which you choose that music for that Sunday? And then I asked them a bunch of other questions to put them off the scent. And then I asked them the other question I wanted the answer to, which was, when you've played this piece of music and you see the response in your congregation, how do you decide which ones you will use again? And every single person except one, to the second question, said, well, when we sang this song, the congregation loved it. They were singing along. You could see in their body language that they were really enjoying it. The volume of singing went up. They caught the tune just like that. It was a really good singable song. We'll definitely sing that again. Or, traditional hymn, it's rousing. It just makes you want to process out of church or into church, which are musical considerations mostly. The answer to how do you choose music for Sunday was uniformly lyrics. We go look for the lyrics. We find out what the preacher's going to preach about, or we find out what the scripture of the day is, or we find out what the saint or the season, Ascension or Easter or whatever. And then we go and pick lyrics that suit. Absolutely extraordinary that somehow the musical content just gets blanked out in people's choice. Why don't we say it's Easter? A secret is about to be revealed. Something remarkable is going to unfold gradually for the next 50 days. Something about anticipation, something about joy. What songs do we have that make you feel like the world is just about to explode? What songs do we have where the music makes you feel more joyful than anything in the whole wide world? Instead of saying, we've got to have something that says he is risen. Because you don't have to say he is risen. You can, I mean, there's nothing wrong with saying that, but there's more to it. And if you're if you're engaging in the arts, then you have to let them speak in their own voice. And if music is portraying lament or joy or whatever it is, then let the music do the talking.
I want to take you back to that description you gave, and you referred to again just now, you gave near the beginning, about the creative process, where, if you like, you put all the stuff on the table and you don't know what it's going to become.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if I can push you on whether that's a metaphor for the future of the church, that there is, and also perhaps, if I don't want to control your answer too much, but because there seems to me quite an analogy between the future of the church in general and what the church post-COVID looks like. Because I think that the mistakes we can make are similar mistakes, most of which are, let's just have what we had before.
Yeah.
And history doesn't work like that. Life doesn't work like that. But you've described vividly this image of the creative process that you've obviously been involved with. You've composed your own material, you've composed with others, and you've created artifacts with others in lots of different ways, and you're currently creating a community with others. There's something that you've described there about the the letting go of control, the letting go of a clear outcome, that I think is a very heart edge kind of a metaphor. Because while heart edge strives not to be critical of other models of church renewal, there are some pretty powerful ones out there which do have a very clear idea of what the church needs to look like in the future. But on obviously, when you resist those current ideas, people say, "Well, what's your better idea?" And what you're describing is a creative process that doesn't want to determine what its better idea is, but actually says the process of discovering that together is actually what church is. Would that be fair?
It would, but there's a bit more, actually.
Mm-hmm.
You're exactly right about letting go the ultimate outcome, and about putting things on the table and just, hanging back a while. And I think not having a too exact model is in lots of ways a good thing. But let me just give you an example, because it's maybe easier than trying to explain it conceptually. One of the biggest things we ever did at Yale every year, because we weren't there at Christmas, we did an Advent service that was roughly around the end of our semester. And the Advent service was the big shebang service of the year. It was huge. I even had a budget. I mean, that's how big it was. And I used to get my little team plus a few others, and we'd get together. And some weeks beforehand, we'd gather in a room, and I used to roll out a huge piece of paper on a table and put pens all over the place and bits of paint and different stuff. And I used to come with 7 or 8 ideas, maybe a couple of lines from a poem. And I used to say, right, first of all, let me throw some Advent thoughts on the table. Here are some of the things that you might or might not know about Advent and what it's about. And bear in mind, I was working here with a very ecumenical group of people, and some of them didn't know what Advent was, because that wasn't part of their tradition to celebrate Advent as such. Or, well, keep would be a better word than celebrate. So we talked about Advent and the history of it, and how it's about waiting, and it used to be about fasting, but now it's not, and how it used to be about waiting for Christmas, and then Christmas would be Christmas and the days following, and now it's more about Christmas sort of building up towards, and the darkness and the light, and there's a whole bunch of ideas that go with it, and a gazillion poems and songs and different things that you can look at. So I used to arrive, I'd perhaps have something from medieval literature, I'd have a recent poem, I'd have a piece of music, and I would talk a little bit about a couple of the concepts and throw them out on the table, and then say, okay, what does that make you think of? They would then start coming back, and the only rule of this creative meeting was you're not allowed to say we can't afford it, or that's a stupid idea, or we don't have the resources, or we couldn't do that, it's too complicated. You can't say no for any reason. You can only say, okay, that makes me think of. You can add, but you can't take away. And we used to sit there for a couple of hours, and we'd fill up this paper with doodles and words and different ideas. I had a couple of people who were there specifically to write notes as other people were talking. And we ended up with this huge roll of paper, which then completely filled my study wall for the next 4 or 5 days. And for 4 or 5 days following, I would stand there and look and look and look and look at this wall of words and shapes and things. And after a while, something would come out of this mess of ideas. And it was never, look, that's the best idea, or that idea seems to have recurred 5 times, or 6 people talked about starlight, there must be something there. It was much more organic than that, and that something that none of us had thought of would sort of rise out of this mess. I would then put that into some sort of description, send it round to the team and say, that's what I think I'm seeing, talk to me. They would come back, and interestingly, and it's probably just because I've been doing it a long time and I'm quite good at that bit of the process, but nearly always they would come back and say, oh yes, that really is, that's where we want to go. Now what about this? And what if we try that? And the idea would come from all this mess of stuff. But the thing is, we weren't just sitting there saying, we don't know what's going to happen, we'll improvise on the day. And anyway, in the arts, that's not what improvisation is. We were allowing the creative process to enable us to find something that we hadn't thought of yet. But once we had thought of it, then we imagined it into being. And this is a very Coleridgean thought. I mean, you know this, Sam. Coleridge said the one thing that really sets the human race apart as made in the image of God is that we are able to create something out of nothing, in the sense that we can imagine a world into being and then make it happen. And I think looking forward from COVID and looking forward in general, I think we shouldn't just let the future come at us and see what happens. I think we should sit with all our creative faculties, say, what have we got? You know, what's out of all the stuff we love, out of all the stuff we know, and all the things we've heard of, and all the things we haven't tried yet, lay them out, let them speak to us, put them in a different mix, and see what emerges from that. That might be the same but different, or it might be really different, or it might be completely sideways take on what we've done before. But then, having imagined it, bring it into being. And again, you know, without necessarily saying it's got to be like that because we've made a business plan, but to say, let's try that and then see if that works. And I think imagination and then action following is how you deliver on the creative process. Otherwise, you can have lots of ideas, but you'd never do anything. And that's not the idea either. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. I wonder if I could ask a broad question just to finish with. We sometimes talk of Heart Edge as being an exercise in a recomprehension of the Holy Spirit. That's to say, because it's particularly focused on the activity of the Holy Spirit beyond the church, and the church's ability to enjoy and embrace and invite in that activity. Would you say that, in a sense, the sphere of culture and arts that we've been talking about today is a rediscovery of the theology of the Holy Spirit, which perhaps has been underdeveloped, given that we talk so much, for obvious reasons, about Jesus?
Yeah, I like that, Sam. I really do. While you were saying that, I was thinking about the Missio Dei discourse in the 20th century, you know, where missionaries had taken the gospel to other cultures and, perhaps without meaning to, had taken the whole of their culture with them as well and kind of superimposed their culture. And the Missio Dei was a sort of pulling back from that and saying, okay, how about we do mission like this? We go out into the world and we find out what God is doing, and then we join in. And making the connection, saying, I recognize that. That's what I would call that the Holy Spirit. What do you call it? And I think that sort of engagement, yeah, again, it's what you just said a few minutes ago, Sam, about not necessarily making the outcome too definite. You want outcome, but you know, you need to leave the ends open a little bit. Like that. When I was, gosh, I think I was a curate. I was a curate in Ely a long time ago. And Ely is one of those places out on the fens, and the light is very beautiful. And a lot of artists go out there to paint and sculpt and do stuff because the light is so perfect, because there's no hills, so there's nothing to get in the way of the sky. And while I was there, I met a lot of artists. I used to wander into studios and stuff and get chatting. And we were supposed to be having a mission in our church, and it was a habitual thing that I think it was every January or something. I forget the dates exactly, but there was this idea that we were going to have a mission. And I said, well, what if we don't do that? What if we instead ask all the local artists to come and we'll have an arts festival in the church? We'll pick a theme and ask them to come and create art around a theme. So we picked a theme and it was fantastic. Instead of getting 20 people and a preacher, we had 350 people come in, because of course all the artists brought their art. So then they brought their friends to see the art. And then we ended up with fantastic engagement around, and it was a little looser, it was friendly, it wasn't pushy, but the gospel was very clearly laid out. And of course the gospel's all over the building. And people were engaging with church in a friendly, unthreatening way. The number of people who said to me, I've lived in this city all my life and I've never been inside this church, but that wasn't the last time they came. And I think that maybe that's what you're talking about, that you go out and you say, well, that looks like the Holy Spirit to me. But you don't have to impose it on people. You can just, throw an idea out there and say, well, I'm a Christian. That's how I describe that. What do you think of it? And let them talk, and then make friends and see what happens. I'm a terrible evangelist, I have to say that, but I'm astonished at the number of people who seem to wander in and somehow find Jesus anyway.
Well, that's an inspiring place on which to conclude, Maggie. Thanks for that vision of what renewal looks like. You've described very vividly something I think we can all relate to and aspire to practice in our own settings. I'm just going to say a couple of words about next time. Next time is May the 13th, second Thursday in May, when we have the Archbishop of York, Stephen Cottrell, joining us. He's just written a book about the future of the church, so I think he has some ideas about it, and we'd love to hear him share those ideas. Please join us for that. But what I really want to say is Maggie, I think you've embodied exactly what we asked you to join us to talk about, which is the way the Holy Spirit animates us in performing the gospel, and the kinds of communities and the kinds of movement that we become when we create the space for the kind of generativity and creativity that you've been articulating so beautifully. So every blessing on your continued getting used to a very different Britain from the one you left, and your leadership of St. Mary's, and your teaching and your scholarship in Durham, and the way you are, I'm sure you wouldn't use this phrase, but the way you are leading the church in the ways of creativity and the power of the Holy Spirit. Thank you for being our conversation partner tonight, and every blessing on you. And thanks to everybody for joining the call too. See everybody soon, I hope.